Good morning and welcome to our Payroll Compliance and Technology for Not-for-Profits webinar today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Elizabeth Blunt and I will be facilitating this conversation that we're having today in the presentation. But firstly, before we begin video, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and the community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we have our presenters today, and you may think that we're presenting from around the country, but we are all located in Australia. And however, you will notice there's a number of different accents on the webinar today. So firstly, we have James Henry, who is a global expatriate and employment taxes partner, who is originally from Ireland. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello, everybody. Just a quick background. I'm a partner in pay consulting and employment taxes, and my focus is on helping clients ensure that they're paying employees in line with their employee entitlements.
Thank you, James. And then next to James is Andrea. Andrea works closely with James in the same Global Expatriate and Employment Taxes team. What do you do for your clients, Andrea?
I would say my specialism is partnering with legal to understand awards and enterprise agreements to make sure that we have the right calculations.
Thanks, Andrea. And I forgot to mention, Andrea is from Brazil. And then we have Dan Hamovich. Dan is from our digital consulting team and he is originally from Sweden. Dan, what do you specialize in?
Thanks, Elizabeth. So hi, everyone. Dan here. I've specialized in digital transformations, both before the selection of the systems, but also after in the implementation. Also helping organization with improving their data quality and enable AI and automation within those digital transformation journeys. So welcome everyone to the webinar.
Thanks, Dan. And lastly, we have Adam from Manchester in the UK. So Adam is in our consulting team. What's your FAME agenda, Adam?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I'm all about helping organisations adapt to new technologies. So really focused on change management, communications and training. And that's what I'll be talking a little bit about later in the session today. So it's great to be here.
Wonderful, thanks, Adam. And as some background, I am the National Not-for-Profit Leader and an audit partner at BDO. So this webinar will focus on payroll compliance and technology tailored to not-for-profits with a special focus on the SCHADS Award, as many not-for-profits fall under this award. So we'll delve into the interpretation and configuration of the award, highlight the significance of having the right payroll systems, and explore the technical intricacies that make payroll compliance a complex yet crucial task. And first up, I will just go through some brief housekeeping. So if you've got any questions, please submit them into the questions tab. If you experience any technical difficulties, please click support or visit the link on the screen. And after the webinar, you'll be sent an email with all of the presentation slides, a link to the webinar recording, access to other webinars, and all of our contact details for the speakers today. Also, I do welcome you to submit your questions, and we will do our best to get to those questions throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar. But if we don't, we will follow up with answers to your questions. And so first up is the focus on pay compliance, and James will be presenting now. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So yeah, thanks everybody. As I said earlier, I'm a partner in our expatriate and employment tax team, but my main focus is around pay consulting and payroll compliance. So that is helping employers make sure that they're paying employees the correct amount in line with those legal obligations, which I'll touch on. So as we already covered, I'm from Ireland, and when I moved here 7 years ago, really wage theft was being bombarded in the media. And having come from a country where the only real compliance requirement is to ensure paying a minimum wage, which might be around €10 per hour, it was pretty surprising and very interesting to me. And I suppose if you've been in Australia all your life and you think that it's surprising that a country might only have a minimum rate requirement, that is probably the norm worldwide, and it's actually Australia that's really the unique and special country that has these modern awards and enterprise agreements and a whole host of clauses that keep employers busy and myself busy. So as I said, when I arrived here about 7 years ago, Fair Work were really starting to pique their interest in realizing that employers were really struggling to pay their employees in line with these awards. So there was various waves of reviews from Fair Work, and I think everybody might remember George Columbaris, and it's starting out with the hospitality industry, but definitely there's been a cycle of various industries being targeted, and not-for-profit industry has definitely been one of those that have had their time in the sunshine with Fair Work, and highlighted really the difficulties for that industry in maintaining records and also making sure that they're paying employees correctly. I won't assume any knowledge here, I'll definitely try not to, so I might just give a quick background as to what pay compliance is. As I said, it's paying employees their entitlements, their appropriate legal entitlements. So when we say legal entitlements, what do we mean? Entitlements are driven by various instruments, which make it more complicated. You've got the National Employment Standards, which is really basic. It's kind of, here's a minimum wage, here's a minimum salary, and various leave requirements that employees are entitled to. Then it gets a little bit more complicated with an industry award. So we're all talking about the SCHADS Award industry awards today, but there's more than 100 awards in Australia, various different industries. And then that becomes extra complicated when you add in that certain businesses and employers will negotiate their own enterprise agreement or enterprise bargaining agreement. So that is basically a variation of an industry award. So Fair Work have their industry awards, and an enterprise agreement is a variation of that specific to a business. So often problems can come there where negotiations for enterprise agreements can be pretty silent on certain matters around that the award might be very clear on what it says, but maybe the enterprise agreement assumes that it's known from the award, and then there's a bit of a gap in knowledge. And the last legal instrument is obviously an employee contract. So an employee contract has a significant bearing on what an employee should be paid. So again, why is it important? And as I mentioned, it's the law. You have to do it. There's no two ways about it. Other big implications of it are around employee satisfaction. So when you see these huge articles in the media of employers paying their employees incorrectly and the massive underpayments involved in it, you have to think the employees working for those employers are thinking, have I been underpaid or am I being treated correctly? And does that impact your ability to attract new talent and attract new hires to your firm? Media attention, you can see from the current slide as to how the media recognize it. It's called wage theft. I don't like to call it wage theft. It's a very complicated system, and it's not really, it's not always purposeful. It's not always the intent to underpay. It's just quite complicated, and maybe businesses are under-resourced in being able to facilitate it. From a not-for-profit perspective, you don't want to be in the media like this. You need brand trust, you need public trust. So the last thing a not-for-profit employer wants to be is in the media for this type of attention. Remediation costs and effort. So some of you may have been through some difficulties in underpayment issues, or maybe have heard of people who have been through those difficulties. There's a huge remediation cost involved in it. It goes on for years. You'll be paying firms a significant amount in fees to remediate. There's on costs around payroll tax, interest to employees, and so on and so forth. And really the time it takes to get it to completion is a really long time. If Fair Work are involved in a remediation, it can go on for years, and then employers are hit with an enforceable undertaking, which my colleague Andrea will touch on a little bit later. And that really is something that, again, there's obligations around the employer to continue with certain obligations across a number of years, and really hoops to jump through is what I like to call them. And then the final one is criminalization. So maybe if we move on to the next slide here, I won't talk to it too much, but this is something that's topical as of 2025 and probably 2024 as it's coming in. This came into effect from 1 January 2025. While it's effectively putting into effect a legal framework for knowingly underpaying employees. So there's a big difference there between making mistakes and knowingly underpaying employees. It's really significant impact if you get it wrong. So from an individual perspective, again, this is untested. It only came into effect from the start of the year, but and we don't know what would be considered knowingly versus maybe being really bad in your controls and compliance around it. But you've got corporations where you see 3 times the underpayment can really exceed that 8 million amount very quickly. And from an individual perspective, who are the individuals? Again, not overly clear at the minute. It could be board members, or it could be people in a payroll or a human resource team. Well, I think that's unlikely. If they were really purposefully contributing to underpayments, then that's definitely a possibility. Moving on to how to maintain compliance. So if we move on to the next slide. When I have conversations with clients, I like to talk to the 4 pillars of compliance. So while we're probably going to focus on pay against award, so keeping in line with the SCHADS Award today, there are 3 other areas that as an employer you want to at least have some consideration for. So generally we flag these 4 areas, although we might only deal with one at a time. Touching on a wage code review. So a wage code review is a review of a business's active pay codes to make sure that they're appropriately set up and configured for employment taxes. So are they attracting super correctly and so on? And that can really be where in a payroll system or a payroll team that can fall by the wayside quite quickly. And as the rush to get a new pay code to set up into the system occurs, maybe there can be a low consideration as to what's the employment taxes that should be attracting to it. Leave accrual, something very topical at the minute, generally driven by long service leave issues. So you may have seen in the media issues with employers who maybe have employees that work across various states. Australia is a strange country in that there's different rules for accruing long service leave in each state. So that makes things very difficult for employers. And really, if you've got post-COVID world, if you've got employees moving between states, and maybe it's not being picked up correctly by the employer, are you incorrectly paying out your long service leave? Are you incorrectly accruing your long service leave? And really, it can make a big difference. Coupled with, in this specific industry, some people have portable long service leave compliance requirements to contend with as well, and those quarterly reporting obligations. And then finally, just to touch on pay process review. So a payroll process review would be from a risk perspective as to the controls in place for a payroll team. So maybe a walkthrough would happen with the team to see how payroll occurs, whether it's fortnightly or monthly, and what the practices are there, how things are recorded, what's the security around payroll, and so on and so forth. But just to move back to pay against award, because that's the main thing, hopefully you can consider the other pillars in your own mind and whether there's something that needs attention in your business, or if you feel pretty comfortable that you've got them under control, then that's a good thing. So pay against award, I might move on to the next slide here. And really, from a pay against award perspective, what we would be looking to do is 3 types of remediation. So if you find that you've got a award issue, there's really 3 different ways of solving it. You either don't know you have an issue and you have good controls and you do a check. So we can do a light check, or there can be a deep dive review depending on resources and what the business feels is appropriate for them. But that would be basically taking a sample and looking at it and making sure that they're being paid appropriately against either the SCHADS Award or that enterprise agreement that you might have in place. So you're in a good position if you're doing that. It means that you're being proactive, you've got good controls, and you're trying to make sure that your employees are being paid correctly. A little bit more complicated when it gets to targeted review and full review. So targeted review means that you have an issue, but hopefully it's something that's limited. So this is where you realize you have an issue and you need to remediate it to pay the employees correctly. So what you would do here is hope that it can be siloed to a specific issue, for example, a weekend penalty, realize that it's been set up maybe incorrectly in your payroll and try to remediate for that. So that's a lot more of a siloed and surgical approach, and definitely be a good outcome for a business if they realize they had an issue. And then really what you don't want to be getting into is the full review and full remediation. So that is the examples that you see in the media where there's really been lots of problems in the business, lots of errors, fair work are involved, and you're basically having to recalculate time and attendance data and paid data against all of the awarding requirements and making sure that you are paying them correctly. So you'd have employee by employee underpayment amounts. So just to flag as well, when we do this type of work, we like to work with employment law firms. We're not lawyers. We don't provide legal advice, and BDO are very clear on that. And employment lawyers are really helpful for a number of reasons on this across those three types of review. Number one, they can provide privilege over the work being done. So if there are issues or if issues pop up, it can be really dealt with in a confined space without worry of it going where it shouldn't. And then also, as I mentioned, we're not lawyers, but employment lawyers are lawyers, and they can provide really good validation around interpretation. So a lot of the clauses can be ambiguous, or maybe an enterprise agreement clauses are ambiguous, and also give employer satisfaction around classifications. So Andrea will mention this in a little bit, but classifications or incorrect classifications are something that can definitely trip up an employer in this industry. So maybe moving on to the next slide, and these are the common causes that I wanted to talk to. So these are really, if you're on this call and you want to maybe have an idea of whether you're at risk profile or whether it's something that you need to give further attention to, in our experience, these are real primary drivers of reasons as to why underpayments can happen. And in my experience, I'd like to point out it's not generally intentional. So when we go back to that criminalization, it's generally not a known issue, but it might be that it hasn't been given enough attention to. So I won't go through all of the items on this slide, but I'll talk to some of the ones that are maybe most important to the NFP industry. I think we've got a little bit of background noise, if everybody could just make sure they're muted. So set off and offsetting. So that's this second one you can see on your left-hand side. And really that is one that is very difficult to deal with for most businesses and employers that have issues. They've got a set and forget approach. So maybe a salary that's been, sorry, if everybody doesn't mind just muting if they can. There's just a little bit of background noise. So that set and forget approach, it can maybe be towards salaries or a higher hourly rate. So one red flag to me is when I speak to clients and they say, oh, we're okay, we pay a salary or we pay above the award or we pay a higher hourly rate. And while that's really good in a lot of instances, if you're not really set up to be able to do that and be allowed to do that, it can really lead to really significant underpayment issues. Basically, if the hours that the employee are actually working mean that they should have got paid more than the amount that you're paying them under the award, then it would be counted as an underpayment. And one thing that's really come to the fore in recent weeks is Woolworths and Coles. So maybe people on this webinar have heard about this, but a couple of weeks ago, there's been a long-awaited judgment for Woolworths and Coles. And while that's with the retail industry, it will have really big impact on every industry. And a lot has come out of that case, but one thing that really strikes me is around set off and offsetting. So again, you may have heard about this, but quick context and quick background. These employees were paid salary, so annual salary. So they basically had in their contract that they were getting paid, they were to be paid an annual salary and maybe some entitlements above that. And the judgment found that even though they were paid an annual amount, only what was paid to them in a pay period could be offset against time worked in that pay period. So it really limited the ability to smooth it out over a year. So if you think maybe you've got busy periods where people are working a lot more, but it's okay, they're paid a salary and over the year, that will even itself out. From the current judgment, that won't be allowed. So that's an interesting one to keep an eye on. It's definitely interesting if you are an employer who pays salaries that you really want to get on top of and checking, or if you feel like you're protected by a salary or a higher hourly rate. Another point I wanted to touch on was a small payroll and really human resource team as well. So generally in the NFP industry, we can deal with employers who have a really difficult resourcing constraints, and you end up with a small payroll team or a small human resource team, or maybe even a hybrid of each. And that can lead to problems because you've got low resources in the team, which makes it more difficult at payroll processing time. but also maybe if there's a change in the team. So maybe knowledge has sat with one person for a long time, and then you've got a change in personnel, and all that knowledge can go out the door. And unless everything is documented, it's very difficult for the new person to pick up, and items can fall through the gaps. Hiring in those industries, if you don't have an industry experience in HR or in payroll, that would mean that you wouldn't have industry experience with the SCHADS Award, which is something that's very important to be able to make sure that you're aligning to it. And that would lead into the next point on low focus on the top right, so low focus on award compliance. So that might mean that you've never considered a check before, you're aware of being under the SCHADS Award, but maybe you don't have regular payroll checks in place to make sure that you're paying correctly against it. Maybe you're not checking classifications because an employee might have been hired and classified correctly then, but has their role changed quite a bit so that they should have gone up in classification and therefore receive a higher hourly rate. So that's another area that if you're sitting here and you've not really considered pay compliance too much, and you've joined this webinar with the hope of getting ideas to what to do, it might be time for a high level check. Global software. So again, in the NFP industry, we noticed that, and Australia nationwide, global software can be used as a time recording tool. So clock in and clock out. And a lot of them are US tools, and they actually round the time. So maybe somebody's clocked in at 10 to 9 rather than 9, and that's being paid as from 9 o'clock and ignoring those 10 minutes. So while it might seem like an issue, if it's happening, a small issue, if it's happening every day, it really accrues over time. And from a fair work perspective, if an employee is working, the employee needs to be paid for the time that they have been working. Insufficient records is another one. So are you correctly recording time worked, break times, and employee agreements? So when I say employee agreements, there's often areas in an award that allows for time off in lieu of overtime. So an employee's worked overtime, and instead of being paid for it, they just get time off. So while that is allowed, there's a lot of constraints around how it needs to be documented. So there needs to be documentation recorded of employee agreement to be able to do that. And in lieu of that, Fair Work would say if you don't have records, it didn't happen effectively. And the last one that I would point to is just overtime triggers. So a lot of the time in this industry, we see a kind of low knowledge base around what triggers overtime. And SCHADS Award is complicated, so we can understand why that might be difficult to maintain. But as I said, if you're not clear on when overtime should be triggered, that can really impact on underpayments, because you're talking about that you've not paid maybe double the time that the employee should have been paid for. So hopefully you found that helpful. Andrea's going to talk a little bit more now around some specific SCHADS issues for you to be aware of. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Appreciate the background. And I thought something you mentioned recently was the clients that are, I think, because as I mentioned, I'm an audit partner, clients most at risk are those that say, oh, we pay everyone above award. So it is much more complex than just paying above award. And Andrea will now talk about the SCHADS Award. Thanks, Andrea.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I will just start talking a little bit about the SCHADS. I think probably, Elizabeth, if you stay a little bit on the SCHADS and let's think about it, it's probably one of the most complex instruments in Australia. But I think the SCHADS is not only complex, it's dynamic. From broken shift allowances to classification errors, the risks are real and often costly. Employees need to ensure that the payroll system are not only compliant, but agile enough to adapt to the award changes. At BDO, we have firsthand seen how legacy issues, poor configurations, not understanding how the SCHADS work can lead to underpayments and reputational damage. So then today we'll be talking of one of the aspects of the SCHADS, which is the broken shifts. We will explore the broken shifts allowances and specifically the shifts that are more than 12 hours. So just a little bit before I dig into the award interpretations, understanding of broken shifts, I just want to highlight something that James also mentioned, that interpretations and classifications, it's a legal matter. Like why BDO provides guidance, and I'll be talking about it here. We are not a legal firm, so anything that will be said needs to be validated with your legal team to ensure it aligns with your organization's specific obligations. So one of the clauses that we'll be diving into the interpretation is the broken shifts. So from the 1st of July 2022, the award recognized the working multiple shifts in a day and introduced the broken shift allowance. This broken shift allowance applies to home care employees and social and community service employees when undertaking disability service work. So you can start already understanding that to trigger this clause, there are some characteristics of your workforce that needs to be set up on your payroll system to trigger them. So then a broken shift is defined as 2 periods of work separated by 1 paid break, or 3 periods of work separated by 2 unpaid breaks. For the second scenario, when there is 3 periods of work with 2 unpaid breaks, the employee must agree to work that shift, unless it's part of a pre-agreed pattern. So again, you needed to understand how all kind of intercalates between rostering the employees, hiring the employees, and putting a system. So the award does not specify a minimum duration for the unpaid breaks, but practically we see that's 1 minute. So someone can start a shift, clock in for the start of the shift, clock out for the end of the shift, have an unpaid break that can start from 1 minute, and then start another shift, and that can be considered as a broken shift. This change reflecting the nature of the sector, yes, and kind of the award allowances for broken shifts is to compensate employee fairly for fragmented shifts. So I will talk a little bit now what is the entitlement. So for broken shifts of 2 periods of work, an employee must be paid an allowance of 1.7% of the standard rate. So the standard rate from the 1st of July 2025 is $20.82 per shift. Then for broken shifts consisting of 3 periods of work, an employee must be paid an allowance of 2.25% of the standard rate, that is currently $27.56 per shift. So just to give you an example, what your system needs to be configured. So a broken shifts occur when I mentioned an employee works, imagine from a 9 a.m. shift to an 11 a.m. shift. Then they takes a 3-hour unpaid break and then works again from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. on that same day. In this scenario, the employee is entitled to a broken shift allowance of 1.7% of the rate because it's just with 1 unpaid break. If he stopped again and he started another shift later on at night, then there'll be 2 unpaid breaks, and then there'll be the other allowance. I think that's the first rules, and just give you a feeling of the intricacies. Then the second rule is the broken shifts when the total span exceeds 12 hours. So any shift spanning more than 12 hours from the start of the first shift to the end of the last shift, including those unpaid breaks, requires double time payment for hours worked beyond the 12 hours. Yes, it's important to understand that the 12 hours commence at the start of the shift and ends at the end of the shift. We kind of saw some of underpayments that the 12 hours rules was configured for 12 hours working shifts. So just to give an example, an employee works their first shift at 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Then they take an unpaid break from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. and then resumes to work from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Although the total hours are 8, from 8 to 11, 11 to 5, and 5 to 10, the span of the shift is 14 hours because it starts at 8 a.m. and finishes at 10 p.m. So under the award, the final 2 hours must be paid at the double time because it exceeds 12 hours. So that's another rule that needs to be set up and configured with your payroll system. Yes. And I think the next one, then I will talk about it. Yes. So this is some importances of the technology, and I'm conscious that Dan also mentioned some, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of all the rules from the SCHADS that when configured can bring in some issues, which is mentioning about some of the common pitfalls. I think some that we noticed during our underpayments is failing to configure the systems for the rostering. A common system configuration is the difference between the 76 hours and 38 hours. So the SCHADS prescribes several working patterns. So an employee can work 38 hours per 5 shifts, 76 hours per fortnight, or 152 hours over 19 shifts. So as I mentioned, how dynamic the SCHADS work and how dynamic the workforce is, it kind of creates the intricacies and complexities in what system and how technology can be supported. Another pitfall is on the classification challenges. I think one of the biggest reasons or sources of confusions and that adds the complexity of the SCHADS are the classifications. And there is lots of levels and classifications and lots of, is it social community, crisis, is home care, and under each of those areas, we have the levels and the pay points. And to define the pay points, some can start at 1, and depending on the education and experience, not necessarily an employee will start as a pay point 1. Some of the classifications might start at already on level 3 or level 4, depending on the employee classification. What is good to know is that the Fair Work is working on simplifying the SCHADS classification in 2026. Then that will hopefully reduce this misclassifications risk and also give the employer and employee a clear career pathway. Another common pitfall is the minimum payments. So from the 1st of July 2022, part-time employees must be paid a minimum number of hours per shift. And that can be also related per the shift as a single shift or per the shift as a broken shift. So on the scenario that I mentioned, if an employee works from 8 to 9 or 8 to 10, that can also need to be considered. So social and community service employees, excluding disability service, it's a minimum of 3 hours. All other employees is 2 hours. So these minimum payments requirements are essential for compliance and must be reflected in the payroll system. So that will give you a little bit of a flavor of the complexity of the interpretations of broken shifts for the SCHADS. But before I kind of handing over to Dan, I wanted to kind of finalize this session telling you like a real world example, which is recent. So early this month, a Victoria NDIS provider entered into an enforceable undertaking after systemic underpayments were identified. So the investigation was triggered by an employee complaint regarding a missing broken shift allowance and minimum engagement payments for work being performed between 2022 and 2024. So that's critical that the provider acknowledge that this issue is systemic. So other employees will also be impacted. So what do I understand that is the system was not set up for the broken shift allowances and the minimum engagement. So one employee make the complaint for the Fair Work investigated, now have signed an enforceable undertaking. So that kind of highlights the importance of understanding your SCHADS and understanding if the rules and the interpretations is configured correctly. So I think now I can kind of hand you over.
Thanks, Andrea. That was fantastic. And I think what you really highlighted there was the fact that an audit, an internal audit, doesn't always pick up on these issues. An audit, we look at, are people being paid in accordance with their contract? However, it's not looking at broken shifts. It's not confirming that people are getting paid on the right the right shift. So the payroll compliance review goes into much more detail, and that is why there are all of these underpayment findings that have come about in large organisations that have external audits and internal audits, because the payroll compliance, and especially the SCHADS Award, is so complex. So thank you very much. And now moving on to Dan is going to discuss the payroll technology, because I know there has certainly been instances where the payroll systems are not sophisticated enough to ensure payroll compliance, especially with the SCHADS Award. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. So in the light of what James and Andrea just highlighted, we can see that payroll technology plays a critical role. We've seen it both supporting payroll teams, but also challenging payroll teams. So looking ahead to 2025, payroll technology is continuing to evolve. And there's three main trends that we're already seeing taking shape. First one, integration. So integration remains the #1 pain point for payroll teams. In a fresh survey of around 2,000 organizations by the Australian Payroll Association, 24% report poor integration between payroll, HR, and financial systems. We can especially see that this is challenging in the mid-market segment, where integration gaps lead to manual work, compliance risk, and limited visibility. So it's worth stressing here that, and as you probably can appreciate, integration gaps is not just an IT issue. We'll talk more on that a little bit later. The key takeaway here is to make integration a focus point when selecting and implementing payroll systems. Second, we have AI and automation. It starts to challenge how payroll teams work. It's being used to automate award interpretations, run compliance checks, reduce manual errors. Many new cloud-native payroll platforms that we see entering the Australian market, especially from the US, are now including these AI capabilities out of the box. But concern remains on accuracy and reliability. So the message here is use AI to support compliance and efficiency, but it's not here to replace payroll expertise. Thirdly, the payroll technology market in Australia is extremely crowded and fragmented. The top 3 and 4 systems combined holds about 1/3 of the market share. Then there is a large cluster of the mid-tier players, and then it's about around 20% of organizations that use very niche payroll providers. So some of the payroll systems that we never heard about. So there is a big segment in the middle and a very long tail with very niche systems. So BDO have tracked around 60 payroll systems in our directory, and I'm sure that the Australian Payroll Association has tracked even more. So there's no one-size-fits-all here solution here. The right choice depends on your business complexity, your integration needs, and the compliance requirements. So let's go to the next slide. So with that in context, let's look at how payroll systems typically evolve and where real opportunities for efficiency and return of investment lies. As you now at this point understand that payroll system isn't just about paying people, it's about interpreting awards correctly, managing your EBAs, staying compliant, doing all that efficiently. So when systems are unintegrated, payroll can still function, but we can see that it comes with more admin heavy, it gets more error prone, less efficient, and in many cases it challenges the single source of truth. So this payroll system maturity ladder, as you can see on the screen, is a very simplified model that helps visualize the journey. In reality, in many cases, especially in the mid-market, we can typically see that there's many more systems and multi-systems set up than just an HR and time and attendance. We can see a separate system for volunteer management, a separate for rostering, etc. But this model really just helps us to see the key stages. So let's start at the very bottom. At the very bottom, we have typically micro, not-for-profit organization with 10 staff or few. There might be a financial system, it might not, but most importantly, payroll and also HR processes are very manual here. This means high admin load and high risk of errors. Organization A then grows into organization B. This is where a payroll system gets alongside with a finance system. This makes processing easier. We see that it reduces some risk, but it's still fairly basic with limited automation and minimal integrations. Already here we can see that some organization actually select the wrong payroll system that is not fully and have those connectors to the financial system. So it is important to try to find that payroll system that already have those connectors to the financial system that you already have. So organization C, this is where organization enters typically the mid-market. They often add a HR, a time and attendance, or a rostering system. But what stands out is that all those systems in relation to finance and payroll systems remain separated. So this is where the journey of integration challenges grow, compliance risk increase, and we see that payroll teams spend more time moving data between systems than focusing on value. So now being in the mid-market, we also I like to introduce what we call the point of leverage. So this is when organization C shifts to organization D. Here, HR and payroll is one system. So this is especially impactful when we see not-for-profit organizations that have a positive time capture. They gain the benefits of having clock-in data flow directly into payroll. But there's a number of other benefits here. Award interpretation becomes far easier with rules applied consistently across the position in the HR core, the rosters, the pay, etc. So here we can see the organization gain shorter payroll cycle times. We see that compliance confidence increased drastically and trust within the organization. And there's many options here at this stage, from one-tier full-featured human capital management suites to more lighter players where they just focus on the time and attendance and the payroll integration. And we can clearly see that the choice that you do here and the right fit at this stage accelerate return much faster than in any other point in this ladder. In fact, we have seen that some organizations, they skip that multi-system stage and they're moving straight from organization B to organization D setup. And this is if budget and the clarity allows. We see that these organizations avoid sometimes years of inefficiencies. At the very top, we see an enterprise scaled platform like Workday, SAP, Technology One, Microsoft. This is an integrated with HR, payroll, and finance. This isn't necessarily a maturity step. I have to say it's more often a strategic trade-off organization tend to do. It's either maintaining the benefits of the best of breed systems and their specialized payroll and HR functionality, or take the advantage of pre-configured integration within an all-in-one single suite platform. But let's return to the point of leverage. When you convert into an organization D and system evaluation and selection becomes critical, right? So this is where you dig deeper. You're looking not just at your business case, your return on investment potentials, but you look at which features in the system will sustain compliance and efficiency over time. So what we see here is that some solution excels at complex award EBA configurations, and other, they focus more on the strong payroll integrations with a lighter HR core. So from what we've seen, and really tied back to what Andrea said previously, the way organization get most value out of this stage is to look closer into compliance-driven features. And I've highlighted 5 of them here in the corner. So the first one being looking into how the system configure and automate award and EBAs, how it automate those rules, how it reduce manual calculations and compliance risks. So that's very important. Secondly, we see that it is important to evaluate how time data flows, so the real-time timesheets integration, and this usually prevents delays and mismatches. Thirdly, automated payroll calculation, so looking into to calculate the pay, the load, the penalties, so without really looking at to manual intervention. So there's a lot of different systems that makes that differently. And then you have the leave and entitlement tracking and the audit trails and report. So these are what I would say the 5 key points to look for and feature to look for. So just to summarize that, in our experience, the big value for not-for-profit from a payroll perspective really comes from adding more systems. It comes from making payroll work seamlessly within your IT landscape and other systems, and at the level that best suits your organization needs.
Thank you very much, Dan. We did have a question come through in regards to payroll systems, asking what are the top 3 systems that you recommend. However, I think the answer to that would very much be it depends on the organization. Is that right?
Yeah, that totally depends. It depends what system you have in the landscape and really what you need, what your organization need, and the compliance. So what we usually do at BDO, we help to assess that for organizations, and from there we do a system selection evaluation.
Fantastic. And I think as well, what is so important is to ensure that the system is appropriately integrated and set up. And so you're making best use of that system. But as well, what Adam's going to discuss is the human dimensions of implementing a new system. Is that right, Adam?
It is indeed. It's a great segue.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dan. That was great. And I'll hand over to you, Adam. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, as I said, good morning, everybody. And I just wanted to spend the next sort of 10 minutes, probably less than 10 minutes, just on giving you a little bit of colour around what we mean by change management and why it's so important, particularly in the not-for-profit space. The sector that we all work in, this sector, is really tough, particularly with a lot of frontline staff, many of whom, or some of whom at least, may not have English as a first language, may not be super tech savvy, may not have a corporate email or work device. And so effective communication and change management with this group can be particularly challenging to get right. And so, and many of you will be living and breathing that every day. And so in the context of new systems, whether they're new rostering systems, new payroll technologies, new HR or HCM, human capital management technology, so that whether it's a Workday or a Dayforce, all of that requires really careful thought. And so one thing that we've got to make sure that we get right is communicating the importance of the change. And so often in change, we talk about the narrative or the story. Why do we need people to get on board with something? And that's all about moving them through this sort of change curve, which many of you will be kind of familiar with. And we want to shift people from being simply aware of a change to actively accepting it, committing to it, and adopting it. So such that when the new technology goes live, adoption is at a good level and people are actually using the new technology, whether that's to access their roster effectively, or whether that's to kind of do a timesheet or perhaps put some expenses through. Particularly within this workforce segment, you've obviously got, oftentimes have a lot of volunteers, people maybe not with their own mobile devices. And in a moment or two, I'll just talk to some of the tools and techniques that we're using in the not-for-profit sector to engage highly distributed workforces who perhaps are, on their mobile devices, perhaps putting some notes in after they're perhaps after they've seen a client, for example, in the health or care sector. And so I've got a few techniques there which I'd just like to talk to as well a little bit. Just over the page, I wanted just as well to spend a little bit of time talking about the value of change more broadly, and what are some of the kind of key stats. I'm always a little bit I'm always kind of interested to gauge people's reactions when these stats go up. One of the things we do know is when you don't put enough change management into a technology-driven initiative, 80% of those digital transformations fail. And so just piggybacking off what Dan was saying, we've got to make sure that we invest not just in getting the technology selection right, but actually then that we invest in people as well, and that we know, the stats bear this out, that over 70% of projects that do invest in change management are more likely to return a better return on that particular investment. And quite often, and this is something that you may see in your organizations, many people resist the technology change or resist change more generally because, one, as humans we don't like change, and that's sort of quite innate, but two, quite often we've not been clear about why it's important for people to get on board. We've not done all of that upfront stakeholder management. We've not brought people along that journey. And so, particularly in this sector, I do a lot of work with clients, particularly in that upfront space, to set the project up for success before we even get into the mechanics of sending out comms and getting people in for training. But we know that where in particular there is an investment in change, there's better alignment from leadership. We're likely to see higher adoption and also greater proficiency in using that technology as well. So less calls to help desk, less frantic emails, less sort of people perhaps not doing the timesheets or getting errors in the roster because effectively we've invested in that change effort up front. Just over the page, we've got a little bit more detail in terms of where we sort of fit into the picture. So my team, as I said, really focused on change. We work with a variety of vendors, whether it's Dayforce or SAP or Workday. And so we will team with you, oftentimes, your organizations like yours, on the people side of things. And maybe you've got a vendor in at the moment helping with some technology. My team kind of typically click in and support, working with you and the vendor to make sure that the technology is taken into the organization effectively. And so it's kind of the glue, if you like, between the system and your front line as well. And the intent when we do change isn't just that it's lots of comms and lots of training. What we really like to do is to make sure we're a connected, collaborative team, but also that we're building your internal capability to do more change in the future. And one of the things that we do know is that change is pretty constant. I think we all live that. We're all kind of backed up with things that are new initiatives, new strategies, new technologies. There's always, new mission statements. There's always things kind of coming down the track. And so building change muscle within your frontline and your workforce more broadly is really important. And that's something my team spend a lot of time doing with leaders in organizations. To build their ability to lead through change. How do I communicate my change vision? How do I manage resistance? How do I get people on board with what I'm trying to achieve by introducing a change to process or a change to technology? And that's a really important strategic part of what we do. over the page, I've got a little bit more detail around training, because I think what often manifests when we talk about change management is it's just training, and it's not just training, but training is a really, really important part of the overall mix. And so making sure that, particularly in sectors like this, like yours, where the tracking of completion, the tracking of competence is really important when training's rolled out, and making sure that that training selection, that training material is bite size, fit for purpose, mobile enabled. They're all the kind of things that my team and I spend a lot of time thinking about. We've also, and we do the full life cycle, and that's those sort of dot points there. So training needs analysis, the training strategy, the actual production of training content. We have trainers that will actually go out and deliver that training, whether it's perhaps only rostering or system, for example. And typically, we also spend some time with train the trainer in a sort of train the trainer model as well. So making sure, again, we're building the capability of your people to sustain through a change, so that we're not just sort of coming in and then kind of go back out and you're not left with that capability afterwards. So that's pretty common. BDO's also just signed a new partnership, and went in, the media release went out on Friday, but new partnerships with both Pendo and with Staffbase. And I'll come back to Staffbase, but on Pendo specifically, that's a digital adoption layer that sort of sits across new technologies, so a new rostering system or a new time entry system. And that sort of, I almost liken it to a digital quick reference guide. So instead of having to kind of go off and find perhaps the PDF that's up on a SharePoint, or the training material that's perhaps sits off system somewhere, Pendo is effectively putting that training content in front of the user. So BDO now has a partnership with them to bring Pendo into more of these technology projects, and really happy to organise demos and follow-ups if that's helpful. And then just over the last couple of slides, and you'll get these afterwards, I won't go into all of these, I've just included some of the tools and accelerators that we use on these technology projects. So whether it's pre-built training, we've kind of got pre-built training libraries for most types of technology, quick reference guides, toolkits, and you name it, we've probably got something to help accelerate through that particular journey. And then on the change side of things, we've also just, as I say, inked a new relationship with Staffbase. And some of you on the call may be using Staffbase today, and they're a communications platform. And so some of their clients include Salvation Army and also Lifeblood, so Australian Red Cross, and they are using Staffbase to get to all of their volunteers in hard to reach parts of the organisation. So with that, I'll pause. I'll throw back to Elizabeth. I know we're nearly at time, but if anyone's got any questions, feel free to drop me an email afterwards, or you can follow me on LinkedIn, and happy to connect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. And I think you've really highlighted the importance of implementing the change management process, because so much gets invested into getting the right system. But if you don't implement it appropriately and have that change management process, it's never going to work to its best ability. We've had a number of questions come through in relation to broken shifts, and a number of these are open to legal interpretation. So rather than providing answers to every one of these, we've also we've released a broken shift article on the BDO website. So as part of the materials, we will share that broken shift allowance article with everyone, and we can respond to your questions individually as well around broken shifts. But yeah, it is very complex, and a lot of it is in relation to legal interpretation. But yeah, if there is broken shifts, then the extra penalties do apply most of the time. So a huge thank you to James, Andrea, Dan and Adam for all of your insights that you have shared today. Please subscribe to our articles to receive our insights. We are always coming up with new insights that are impacting the not-for-profit sector and other sectors. We're right on 12 o'clock. So again, thank you for your attendance today. Please feel free to reach out to any of us after this webinar, and we will share a recording of the webinar and the slides. So thanks again. Thank you to our presenters and thank you to all of our attendees. Have a wonderful day.